Picture this. A mother in 1899 walks into a pharmacy with her sick child. The boy has been coughing for weeks. The pharmacist reaches behind the counter and hands her a small brown bottle. The label reads, "Buy a heroin for children's coughs." She pays, says thank you, and goes home to give her son his medicine. She has no idea what she's just bought. This actually happened. Heroin wasn't always sold in dark alleys by dealers. It started in pharmacies, prescribed by doctors, manufactured by one of the most trusted pharmaceutical companies in the world. And for a few years, everyone believed it was safe. This is the story of how medicine became a nightmare. Heroin is one of the most dangerous and addictive drugs on Earth. It's destroyed millions of lives. It's filled prisons, emptied families, and turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. But it didn't start that way. It started as a solution to a real medical problem. It was created by scientists who thought they were helping people. It was sold legally, marketed confidently, and used widely. And then slowly, everything went wrong. This story matters today because we're living through it again. The opioid crisis that's killing tens of thousands of Americans every year follows the exact same pattern. Different drugs, same mistakes. To understand where we are now, we need to understand where this all began. So let's go back. Back to before heroin. Back to the plant that started everything. Origins of opium and morphine. The opium poppy is an ancient plant. Humans have been using it for at least 5,000 years. The Sumerians called it the joy plant. Ancient Egyptians used it. Greek physicians prescribed it. By the 1700s, opium dens filled European and Asian port cities. People knew opium was powerful. They knew it could kill pain. They also knew it could trap you, pull you into addiction, waste your body away. But for most of history, there wasn't much choice. If you were in terrible pain, opium was often the only option. Then, in 1804, a young German chemist named Friedrich Serturner managed to isolate the active ingredient in opium. He called it morphine, after Morpheus, the god of dreams. This was a breakthrough. Morphine was pure, concentrated, 10 times stronger than raw opium. Doctors could measure exact doses. They could predict its effects. But morphine had the same problem as opium. It was addictive, powerfully so. The real change came in 1853 with the invention of the hypodermic syringe. Now morphine could be injected directly into the bloodstream. The relief was instant. The effect was dramatic, and during the American Civil War, army doctors used it by the tens of thousands. Soldiers with shattered limbs, battlefield wounds, infections that would kill them without relief. Morphine kept them alive, kept them sane. But when the war ended, many of those soldiers couldn't stop using it. They'd shake, sweat, suffer terrible pain if they tried to quit. People started calling it the soldier's disease. By the 1880s, morphine addiction was a recognized medical crisis. Doctors were desperate for an alternative. They needed something that killed pain but didn't create dependency. They needed a better morphine. That's the problem heroin was designed to solve. Imagine you're a doctor in 1890. A patient comes to you with tuberculosis. Their lungs are failing, every breath hurts. They cough so violently they can't sleep, can't eat, can't live any kind of normal life. Tuberculosis is killing millions of people every year, and you have almost nothing that helps. Morphine stops the coughing, but you know what happens next. The patient becomes dependent. Their life trades one kind of suffering for another. You need something better. Or imagine a different patient, a factory worker who crushed his hand in machinery. The pain is unbearable. Morphine works, but after a few weeks he needs more. Then more again. You've seen this pattern dozens of times. The drug that saves them also destroys them. This was the central problem of late 19th century medicine. Pain relief versus addiction. There seemed to be no way to have one without the other. Chemists across Europe were racing to find the answer. They modified opium molecules, tested variations, searched for the compound that would finally break the cycle. And in 1874, a researcher in London thought he'd found something. His name was Charles Romilly Alder Wright. Working at St. Mary's Hospital, he took morphine and combined it with a chemical called acetic anhydride. The result was a new substance, diacetylmorphine. He tested it on dogs. They became sleepy, frightened, refused to eat. Wright wrote up his notes and moved on to other projects. For 23 years, that compound sat in research archives, forgotten. Then the Bayer company found it. Bayer was already a giant. They'd created aspirin. They were known for innovation, for scientific rigor, for products that worked. When their research team started looking for a new cough suppressant in the 1890s, they came across Wright's old formula. A chemist named Felix Hoffmann synthesized the compound again. The head of Bayer's research division, Heinrich Drieser, began testing it, first on animals, then on Bayer employees, then on himself. The results seemed incredible. It stopped coughs better than anything they'd tried. It helped tuberculosis patients breathe. And in their early observations, it appeared less addictive than morphine. Some researchers even thought it could be used to help morphine addicts quit. They were catastrophically wrong about that last part, but they didn't know it yet. Bayer needed a brand name. They chose Heroin from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or powerful. It suggested strength, relief, medical progress. The marketing campaign began immediately. By 1898, Bayer was shipping heroin to 23 countries. They sold it as powder, as tablets, as lozenges. Heroin for coughs, heroin for asthma, heroin for bronchitis. Some advertisements showed mothers giving it to children. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Medical journals published favorable reports. Patients said it worked better than anything else they'd tried. And for those first few years, heroin looked like exactly what Bayer claimed. A medical miracle. Here's why it fooled everyone. Heroin converts into morphine inside the body, but it crosses into the brain faster than morphine does. That means the effect hits harder and quicker. The brain's pleasure and reward systems get flooded. But this doesn't show up right away as addiction, especially at the carefully measured doses doctors were prescribing. Dependency builds gradually. The brain adapts. It starts needing the drug just to feel normal. But that process takes weeks or months to become obvious. During that window, everything seemed fine. By 1902, Bayer was producing about a ton of heroin every year. You could walk into almost any pharmacy in America or Europe and buy it over the counter. No prescription required. It sat on shelves next to aspirin and cough syrup. A routine household medicine. And then people started trying to stop taking it. The first warning signs appeared around 1902. As patients who'd been using heroin for several months found they couldn't quit. When they tried, they got the same withdrawal symptoms as morphine, only worse. Intense muscle pain, uncontrollable shaking, violent nausea, a feeling like insects crawling under their skin. Doctors started noticing patterns. Patients were coming back for refills earlier than expected. They were asking for higher doses. Some had started crushing the tablets and injecting the powder, even though heroin was sold as an oral medicine. Medical journals began publishing case studies. A patient treated for tuberculosis, now unable to function without heroin. A woman who'd taken it for a persistent cough, now taking 10 times the original dose. Reports came from Germany, from England, from the United States. By 1910, the medical consensus had shifted completely. Heroin wasn't less addictive than morphine. It was more addictive. Significantly more. Bayer stopped manufacturing it in 1913. But the damage was done. The formula was public knowledge. Other companies had already started producing it. And now there was something new, a population of people who were physically dependent and needed a supply. That's when heroin began its transformation from medicine to street drug. In the 1920s, the United States banned alcohol. Prohibition created vast criminal networks almost overnight. Gangsters who were smuggling whiskey discovered they could also smuggle drugs. And heroin was perfect for smuggling. Tiny amounts, easy to hide, enormously profitable. A kilogram of heroin could be cut with milk powder or quinine and sold many times over. The markup was extraordinary. The penalties were severe, but so were the profits. Heroin started appearing in American cities, particularly in New York. Jazz clubs, poor neighborhoods, places where people were struggling. It spread through communities that had little access to legitimate medical care, where a cheap high could briefly erase hunger, cold, hopelessness. By the 1950s, heroin use had become associated with urban poverty and crime. The drug that had once been sold to middle-class mothers in pharmacies was now being injected in tenement stairwells. The purity varied wildly because dealers cut it with whatever was available. People died from overdoses because they had no way to know what they were actually taking. Then came Vietnam. American soldiers in Southeast Asia had easy access to extremely pure heroin. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was an escape from the horror of combat. By 1971, some estimates suggested that 15% of servicemen in Vietnam were using heroin. When they came home, many brought their addiction with them. This created a second wave, a different demographic. Not just the urban poor anymore, but veterans, young men from small towns, people who'd never touched drugs before being sent to war. Governments responded with criminalization. Harsh penalties, mandatory sentences, a declared war on drugs. Possession of heroin could mean decades in prison. But addiction rates didn't fall. The drug just moved deeper underground. The violence around it got worse, and through all of this, something important was being missed. Heroin addiction wasn't just about the chemical, it was about pain, circumstances, trauma. Studies of Vietnam veterans showed that most who used heroin in Vietnam stopped on their own when they returned home and rebuilt their lives. The environment mattered. The reasons for starting mattered. But policy didn't reflect that understanding. For decades, the approach stayed the same. Punish users, chase suppliers, treat addiction as a criminal problem. Meanwhile, scientists were learning how addiction actually works in the brain. By the 1980s and 1990s, neuroscience had advanced enough to see addiction clearly for the first time. Researchers could watch what heroin does inside the brain. They could trace the pathways, measure the chemical changes, understand why quitting is so agonizingly difficult. Here's what they found. The brain has a reward system that releases chemicals called endorphins when you do something good for survival, eating, connecting with others, achieving a goal. That system is supposed to motivate you to do those things again. Heroin hijacks that system completely. It mimics endorphins, but at a level the brain never naturally produces. The reward signal becomes overwhelmingly strong. The brain adapts by reducing its own endorphin production and becoming less sensitive to normal pleasures. Eventually, the person needs heroin just to feel okay, just to reach what used to be their baseline. Quitting means the brain has to readjust, rebuild those systems. And during that process, everything feels wrong. Food doesn't taste good. Nothing brings joy. The body screams for the drug. That's withdrawal. This understanding led to new approaches. Methadone programs started offering a legal, controlled substitute that prevented withdrawal without producing an intense high. Buprenorphine came later, another maintenance medication. These weren't cures, but they were tools that let people stabilize, function, work, reconnect with family. Some cities started needle exchange programs to prevent disease transmission. Some places stopped arresting users and started offering treatment instead. The evidence showed these approaches worked better than prison. But just as this understanding was developing, just as society was beginning to treat addiction as a medical problem rather than a moral failure, the pharmaceutical industry made the same mistake all over again. In 1996, Purdue Pharma released OxyContin, a prescription painkiller. They marketed it aggressively to doctors. They said it was safe, that the risk of addiction was minimal when used as directed. They had studies, testimonials, sales representatives who visited medical offices across the country. It was 1898 again. A new formulation, new promises, but the same opium molecule underneath. Doctors prescribed it by the millions. People took it after surgeries, after injuries, for chronic back pain. And then, predictably, some patients couldn't stop. When their prescriptions ended or their doctors cut them off, they went looking for alternatives. Heroin was cheaper than pills bought illegally. The pathway was direct. Someone who'd never imagined themselves as a drug user, who'd started with a legitimate prescription after a car accident or a sports injury, found themselves buying heroin. By 2010, America was in a new epidemic. But this one looked different. It affected suburban families, small towns, white middle-class communities. The faces on the news weren't who people expected. The typical victim was someone's son who got hurt playing football, someone's daughter who had wisdom teeth removed. Then came fentanyl. Fentanyl is synthetic, manufactured in labs without needing poppy fields. It's 50 times stronger than heroin. Drug dealers started mixing it into heroin because a tiny amount could stretch their supply dramatically. But the difference between a dose that works and a dose that kills is microscopic. Overdose deaths exploded. In 2022, over 70,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Most involved fentanyl. That's more than died in car accidents, more than died from gun violence, an entire generation being lost to the same pattern that started with Bayer's heroin. We're now 126 years past that pharmacy in 1899, past the mother buying heroin for her child's cough. The chemical that Bayer created still exists in illegal labs around the world. The addiction it causes still destroys families, still fills morgues. But this story isn't really about one drug. It's about how we respond to suffering, about how the promise of relief can blind us to danger, about how what looks like a solution can become the problem. It's about patterns that repeat when we don't learn from them. The poppy fields still grow in Afghanistan, in Mexico, in Myanmar. The chemistry is simple enough that any competent lab can synthesize heroin or fentanyl. And the demand continues because the underlying conditions, the pain and trauma and circumstances that make people vulnerable, those haven't been solved. What began as a medicine became one of the most destructive forces in modern history. Not because anyone intended that, but because at every step we underestimated it. We thought we could control it. We thought the next version would be different. And now, standing in the middle of another crisis, we face the same choice. We can keep repeating the pattern, keep treating addiction as a failure of character rather than a medical condition, keep criminalizing suffering. Or we can finally learn what this story has been trying to teach us for more than a century. That relief and risk are not always easy to separate. That addiction is not a moral weakness, and that the cost of not understanding something can be measured in millions of lives. The question is whether we're ready to listen.